Okay, good afternoon. Let's get this show on the road. Welcome to the Strategic Growth Council July 17th meeting. Why don't we start with Mr. Secretary Laird and come down the line and just do a quick roll call.
Here.
Who are you?
John Laird, Secretary for Natural Resources, or as I keep saying in this meeting, the NRA.
The CNRA.
Michael Flatt, appointed by Mr. Rendon, Speaker Rendon.
Manuel Passot, public member, appointed by President Pro Tem Kevin De Leon.
Karen Ross, Secretary, Food and Agriculture.
Ken Alex, Director of Office of Planning and Research.
Bob Fisher, public member.
Yana Olson-Morgan, California Health and Human Services Agency.
Alexis Podesta, Business Consumer Services and Housing Agency.
Kate White, State Transportation Agency.
Okay, so who would like to move the minutes from last meeting?
So moved.
We have a move and second. Question is called. All in favor of approval of the minutes, say aye.
Aye.
The minutes are approved. All right, any council member updates?
Do you want to start down there?
You have an update? Okay, Karen?
So we just last week announced our final round of funding for the water efficiency program, and we have received applications for this round of dairy digesters. We received 36 applications worth more than $75 million. We have up to $36 million for this round, and we have, because I always relish the opportunities to talk about cow manure. And then we have later this week we'll release.
Isn't that later on the agenda?
Yeah, we will release our guidelines for the application process for the alternative manure management program later this week. But I also wanted to take this opportunity to thank the Strategic Growth Council and the staff for the dollars that have been made available for technical assistance. We have used that for all of our programs. We have seen increased diversity, small, large, those folks where English is not their first language. We've really seen an increase in the applications, and so I can't praise that technical assistance funding. It's a small amount of money that we use through nonprofits or resource conservation districts, and it's really helping to get the word out so we can make sure these programs include everyone.
Thank you. Any other updates? Kate?
Yeah, Kate White with the State Transportation Agency, and just a couple quick updates on Senate Bill 1, which I think at our last meeting I announced that it was signed by the governor at the end of April. It's a new package, a transportation funding package, equaling about $5.4 billion annually. And it's for a whole range of programs, and if you are interested, the public or my sister agencies in being more involved, the California Transportation Commission website has a sign-up form where you can sign up for whichever programs you want to get updated on and find out about the workshops that are ongoing to set the guidelines. But of special interest to this group and to the Strategic Growth Council, I think, are 4 programs. One is the Active Transportation Program, which is nearly doubling its size with the help of SB 1. Secondly and thirdly, our Transit Capital and our Transit Operations programs. Those were first seeded with cap and trade funding, and this SB 1 funding is adding significantly to those 2 pots. And then finally, there's some new funding for planning grants, and SGC has had a longstanding planning grants program. We're building on lessons learned there, and we appreciate SGC and other sister agencies and departments' input in the guidelines, which I believe the draft is public now. Yes, and so these are administered by Caltrans. It's about $25 million a year for planning, which is a pretty good amount for planning dollars, not infrastructure dollars, but and it's going to MPOs and also to local agencies for transportation and land use planning.
Thank you. John?
And then a brief update, but let me add to the one that Kate just made, because also historically with the gas tax, there's been money that has gone to the Parks Department, off-road vehicles, boating and waterways, and in this, it continues funding, but broadens the definition for parks and transportation-related things in what the increase is, and it is a great thing that will be related to some of the things that we do. I also wanted to mention that since we met last time, the draft of the safeguarding, the adaptation plan is out. Many of the people at the table handled some pieces of it. There are community meetings going on around the state to get feedback. There was a legislative request to create a related committee that may well be announced shortly, so watch for that. And then there was also an Urban Rivers grant program that was created budgetarily, and we are just in the process. I know I had to tell some of the people at the end of last week that they were getting the grants, and so I think that will just be publicly and formally announced momentarily.
Thank you. So just as a reminder, if you want to make comments on a particular item, please fill out a card and bring it up to Mackenzie and Ulysses. that you may be aware that there's a small piece of legislation relevant today in the legislature around cap and trade. So a number of us up here and probably in the audience probably need to get back to that at some point. So we're gonna dive in and move through this. So Mr. Director Randall, take it away.
Excellent, and thank you for that introduction, Chair Alex, and good afternoon, council members. As the chair mentioned, we'll try to move pretty briskly here through what is a relatively short agenda. We've got a great presentation first off from our partners at UC Davis, who for some time have been working to develop an evaluation of our technical assistance pilot, and then afterwards, of course, for final approval, our guidelines for the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities Program. Let me just go through a quick set of updates, though, before we dive in on the activities and communications front. So since our last meeting in April, there have been a host of workshops that we've undertaken with our partner agencies associated with our California climate investment programs. I'll mention just a few here, and of course happy to answer any questions related to them, both for the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities Program, of course for our new Transformative Climate Communities Program. We're able to hold a town hall in Fresno in April for TCC, as it's referred to, a meeting in South Los Angeles in Assemblymember Autumn Burke's district and with Assemblymember Burke on the California climate investments, and a tour through the Inland Valley with Senator Leyva and Assemblymember Rodriguez. I'll just note that as we move forward here in our workshops and our rollout of programs, you'll see an increasing effort on the part of staff to coordinate our programs in terms of how folks can actually apply when we're reaching out to communities. We had a couple of examples of that here this past spring, and as we roll out with all the other programs, it's something that we intend to do in an increasing fashion. Kate, and thank you again for mentioning the SB1 transportation funding. Our staff and our teams have been pretty heavily involved in developing the guidelines for both the Sustainable Communities and Adaptation Planning grants. And I did want to take a moment to announce a new member of our staff, Mr. Dove. Caden, you want to raise your hand? You'll hear from him in a moment here. He's helping to lead up our Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities program alongside our partners at HCD. So we welcome you to the team. Sustainable Agricultural and Lands program, pretty quickly here because most of these items we brought forth back in April, but did want to share some new information that has come in from our pre-proposals for the program that were received on June 1st. Now, we won't have full applications due for the program until August 1st, but at this stage, we've received thus far 25 agricultural easements, 2 strategy and outcome grant proposals, approximately $35 million requested in funding, and we are offering technical assistance to those applicants right up until the date. So we'll come back with an update on applications and funding received when we come back to the council for our meeting in later August, but did want to share that update and remind you all that award recommendations will be made in December. Transformative Climate Communities Program, a bit of news here, and again was announced publicly now a couple of weeks ago. To remind everyone, we are on the 3rd revision of our revised scoping guidelines. Those came out on June 5th. We received public comments on June 27th. And just actually on June 7th, with passage of the Budget Act and SB 92, we did receive exemption from the Administrative Procedure Act. So we are able to finalize our timeline for development of the guidelines for transformative climate communities. You can read that here, but a quick overview: we'll release revised program guidelines on July 26th. Intend to bring those guidelines for council consideration on August 24th. Release concept proposals, or a call for concept proposals, shortly thereafter, and make award recommendations in December. Couple couple of quick updates here as well. These are initiatives, again, associated with our high-speed rail efforts. Number one here with integrated regional conservation and development. At our last meeting, I spoke about the 2 demonstration projects that we've been funded to pursue alongside the Wildlife Conservation Board. Now there's another interesting opportunity that we're working in parallel on, and this is again through SB1, a new source of funds for advanced mitigation, and we're looking to align our demonstration pilots from our Wildlife Conservation Board funds with now this new advanced mitigation program through Caltrans. Urban growth and conservation. So a key point here, and this speaks to an item that I mentioned earlier about better coordinating our workshop efforts as we roll out our funds for this year. We had a very successful workshop in Gilroy, a high-speed rail station area city, working with a host of our partner agencies, including the Department of Conservation, Caltrans, ARB, and local and regional partners, really looking at both our Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities program, as well as our Agricultural Land Conservation program, and how those can be leveraged directly at the project level in the very particular context that is Gilroy and the surrounding area. So we do look to, again, repeat that model for future workshops. Health and All Policies, just a note here, probably primarily that our team at Health and All Policies will be presenting to our council next month for finalization of an action plan on parks and green space and healthy tree canopy, which they've been working on in close cooperation with Department of Parks and Recreation, as well as CAL FIRE, and look forward to bringing that forth. Kind of working a little bit backwards here on the items, but equity in government practices we mentioned, I mentioned at the last meeting, and just would note that plan with both the Government Operations Agency and the California Human Resources Department is advancing. Essentially, we are looking to combine how we are embedding equity in state government directly with our state operations efforts to improve human resources and hiring and procurement practices in particular. And so that plan will also be brought forth along with our partner agencies a little bit later this year, likely in the fall. And finally, legislation. Again, it's a little early in the session still, but wanted to share a couple of new pieces of legislation that we are tracking and will continue to track. AB 1433, Assemblymember Wood, which would require SGC to convene a interagency task force to create a common application for a number of programs associated with natural and working lands. And Assemblymember Cervantes with legislation that would affect the AHSC program and how we look at local workforce and development opportunities. But again, it's very early in the legislative process. SGC is, of course, speaking with all of our partner agencies as the weeks and months progress. So with that, I'll pause for any questions or comments or concerns.
Questions, comments for Randall? Manuel?
Yeah, I have some comments about the transformative climate communities, or questions really. I've been glad to see one of the revisions since the last time, which was the previous requirement that program be within 1 mile of a high-speed rail, and that's kind of opened up other kinds of conversations. Couple of things have come up from the groups in Los Angeles, in particular, multiple proposals being developed, which were both working on the assumption of the requirement that 50% of the affected tracks be part of the top 5 for the CalEnviro screen. And then there's been some talk of revising that to 75%, which would be a change for the planning that some of these groups have been putting in to move forward with what look like a multiple set of proposals. I'm not sure which one will come from Los Angeles. So I understand the concern, which is to make sure that we address the most disadvantaged neighborhoods. But I'm also concerned that once the 50% top 5 was in place, shifting that to 75% is going to make it difficult to move some of the planning efforts that have already brought a lot of people together. So I'm wondering if you might comment on that. There's another particular concern from LA, which I'll mention in a second, but maybe you can say something about that one.
Absolutely, and I know that there are the public comments that we've received have been shared online now and are all available to see. That is a concern that did come up in public comments. So along with that concern and a host of others, we certainly recognize it, and I think we are reassessing now the project area and how we're looking at defining that top 5% area. And so we do hope that, and again, we're still in the midst of discussions, but that what we do propose in the new guidelines will be responsive to those concerns. And so thank you for raising that.
Great. And then the second concern, which is perhaps uniquely, again, from Southern California, is, but I don't think so, is that we've, in the last set of guidelines that have been under discussion, required that programs and projects basically square with existing community plans, which is got a very heroic assumption about the state of community plans in Los Angeles, and perhaps unrealistic. It's been the fact that these plans have not been updated, in fact, led to a pretty big battle around a proposition to slow development. I believe that the planning department is jump starting, but if we're going to get a proposal from the city of Los Angeles, and I expect we will, it's going to be hard for it to have the most up-to-date community plans except in very, very few areas. So I'm hoping that that's another consideration that has come up from the public that gets considered as the staff comes up with yet the fourth and fifth and maybe sixth and seventh revision of these guidelines.
Yes, so that is another primary concern that was raised, and for the reasons that you mentioned. Staff is looking closely at that. You know, you're kind of getting at one of the challenges, which is we do want to encourage jurisdictions to undertake updating of their local and regional plans, while at the same time not, obviously disincentivizing, or maybe even some might say punishing, those neighborhoods or parts of a jurisdiction that have done work around planning. So again, I think you'll see some of the language be responsive to that. I'll just name a third one that we're hearing while we're talking about comments that we received. So you mentioned product area. You mentioned plan consistency, and the third area is readiness requirements. With TCC being a multi-year program, one of the responses concerns rather that we heard from stakeholders is, does every single project need to be ready for this 3-year time period, given the both sort of the kinds of communities that we're investing in and the scale and scope of a multi-year program. And so we are looking at that as well to be responsive to those concerns.
Great, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Randall.
Thank you.
So let's move on to item number 6, the AHSC Technical Assistance Pilot Outreach Evaluation Report. Autumn,
Yes.
Welcome.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. It's great to be with you. Autumn Bernstein with UC Davis. I want to say 2 caveats before I start. The first is that I recently accepted a job with ELP Advisors. I'm finishing grad school, and they are one of the teams that is part of your technical assistance pilot. So I'm happy to answer any questions you have about that afterwards.
So this all worked out for you pretty well.
They were totally unconnected, I swear. And the second thing is that I'm 4.5 months pregnant, and so my lungs don't always keep up with my mouth these days. So if it sounds like I'm having a heart attack, I'm not. I just sometimes need to stop and catch my breath when I'm speaking for long periods of time. So I apologize in advance if there's some strange noises coming from the podium. I want to say that my partner in this project, my leader in this project, was Professor Deb Niemeyer from the Institute of Transportation Studies at UC Davis, where I'm completing my master's degree. And she really apologizes she couldn't be here today. She's in Washington, D.C., something she could not get out of. So any of the hard questions that you have, I will deflect and send to her to get back to you when she gets back. So a quick overview of our project. Our charge was to assess the effectiveness of the TA pilot for the AHSC grant program. Our timeline, we started this work in September of 2016, so really as you were wrapping up that round of grant making. Our policy deliverables, we submitted some policy briefs in March to the staff to help, of course, inform the next round of guideline development, and then a final report, which we've submitted a draft now, and we just received back some comments from several of your agencies, and we're working to incorporate those comments before we finalize it. So we should have a final report back to you, I would say, in the next week or two. It's important to say that was not included in our scope of work. We didn't look at all at the recently proposed changes to the guidelines for round 3 that you're going to be voting on today, and changes to the TA program for the next round that are being considered. So we are strictly looking at round 2. After my presentation, you're going to hear from Monica on SGC staff about some of the changes and responses that your staff have already made in response to some of these concerns. So I just wanted to be clear that when you hear the critiques, we're talking about the last round and not some of the changes that are already underway. So as you all know, the technical assistance pilot was initiated last year really in response to some concerns that came up around round 1 in terms of the fact that 17 of the 28 awards that were awarded in round 1 were concentrated in just 4 counties, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Alameda, and Contra Costa, and concern that there was not, we're not seeing the diversity of awardees that we would like to see across the state. So the pilot was created to provide applicants from disadvantaged communities with professional support to make their applications as competitive as possible. The criteria for being eligible for TA in this last round were that the applicant submitted an unsuccessful proposal in round 1 and that the proposed project benefited a disadvantaged community. So there were 63 applicants from round 1 who were eligible to participate in this pilot for round 2, although as we'll get into later, not all of them actually did submit an application in round 2. So as you know, the second round was awarded in fall of 2016. There were 129 concept applications, of which 74 were invited to submit a full application, and 25 of those were awarded. And just a reminder, these are the 3 project area types. It's important to note that the Strategic Growth Council is not the only one providing technical assistance in round 2. In fact, it was a huge, diverse ecosystem of providers. We use the term ecosystem because it's just incredibly complex picture. To try to simplify it, we divide them into 3 buckets. The first bucket on the left is the SGC pilot TA teams, and those were composed of Estelano Lazar Perez advisors, the San Joaquin Council of Governments, and SCAG, the Southern California Association of Governments, with a whole host of subcontractors that you see there on the bottom. Now, the next column over in the middle is what we're calling the major non-pilot TA providers. So these were folks that were operating outside of the context of your pilot, but were supporting a lot of applicants, and generally this technical assistance was also subsidized. So it includes a number of the MPOs. It also includes enterprise community partners who provided assistance to a number of applicants, as well as Transform, and again, a host of smaller subcontractors beneath. And then the third and final category, what we're calling other private TA providers. These are organizations that worked with a smaller number of applicants and generally on a fee-for-service basis. So this was service that people were actually paying for whatever reason, either to complement the subsidized TA they were getting, or because they weren't eligible for subsidized TA and they were actually going into the private market to hire these firms to help them. So the methods of our study, we gathered data from all the major TA providers, the Strategic Growth Council, and other public sources. We felt it was important to not just look at the SGC TA pilot, but look at this larger ecosystem to try to understand how the pilot fit in and complemented or didn't some of the other TA that was being provided. So we gathered data from all of those TA providers. We did an online survey of all round 2 applicants. Of the 129 applicants, about 39, exactly 39, completed our entire survey. And we did interviews with a kind of a cross-section of both applicants and TA providers. And what we found is that technical assistance was really widespread in round 2. 91% of round 2 applicants used some form of technical assistance. So 60% were either working with the SGC pilot or one of these other major providers that I mentioned. And then about 31% were using this other private TA, in other words, the fee-for-service TA. And because we didn't know who all of those smaller providers were, that's really just an estimate based on information that we gleaned from our survey. So we're not exactly sure how many people were using other private TA, but that's our best estimate. And going forward for the rest of this presentation, I'm not going to talk about those other private TA providers very much because we just don't have complete data on them. But I wanted to say we think it's important to note that those who did not receive subsidized technical assistance were willing to pay for it. That's how important they thought it was. So the million-dollar question, did technical assistance make applications more competitive? The answer is overwhelmingly yes. You can see the column on the left is those who received TA, and amongst those who received an award and who didn't. And then on the right is no TA and those who received an award and who didn't. So 24 of the 25 that won an award in round 2 did receive major technical assistance. There was just one who didn't. And those results were consistent across project types and also across disadvantaged communities and non-disadvantaged communities. So we did see that not all TA providers had the same success rate. In fact, it varied quite a bit. The key slide on the key line here is the bottom line, which is the percent of total applicants awarded. So for each of the major TA providers, we looked at how many of the applicants that they worked with actually received an award. And what you see is far and away those who were most successful were those that worked with 2 or more providers. In most cases, this was an applicant who worked with both enterprise community partners and then either the TA pilot or one of the other major providers. And not surprisingly, those projects did quite well because they were getting a lot of assistance. The projects that worked just with enterprise, you see 47% of them won an award. So clearly enterprise was doing something right. They had a very high success rate, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And then the SGC pilot and the other major TA providers were significantly lower in terms of their success rate, but still much higher than those who received no TA at all. So why do we think this was the case? Why did we see these disparities? Well, we think there's a couple of different reasons. The first is that different TA providers were supporting different types of applicants. So the SGC pilot supported more disadvantaged community applicants than any other TA provider. The SGC pilot also worked with more ICP and RIPA projects than other TA providers. Enterprise, which did quite well, worked almost exclusively with TOD projects in very urban areas, which, as we know, historically have been a very competitive type of project for AHSC. The SGC pilot also, we think that the application pool was less competitive by design, in a sense, because these were all projects that did not win an award in round 1, that applied and were unsuccessful. So by their very nature, these applicants had already been shown that they were not as competitive potentially as others.
Mr. Chair, if I can ask a follow-up, and the thing about it is you sort of just answered it, but maybe I'll ask it in different ways. And it just begs the question of whether it's not necessarily one organization that did a great job. It's the subset of who each organization was providing technical assistance to. And I saw that the Sierra Business Council was one, and I assume then they're almost only advising people that are in the Sierra. And so does that mean then that just by nature, people in the Sierra are going to be a step behind rather than the Sierra Business Council did a poor job of advising? And you just, I think, addressed it in terms of disadvantaged communities, but I just wondered if you could tease that out a little more.
Sure, and we're actually going to talk specifically about rural communities in a moment, because rural communities did face some specific challenges. There was not any subsidized technical assistance available to rural communities, so they really had no choice other than to find someone who was willing to work with them and pay for it. Or in the case of, I'm not sure about Sierra Business Council, whether or not they offered that for free or whether it was a fee-for-service, but most of them that were on a fee-for-service basis. We certainly saw that the private TA providers, including enterprise, were not taking all comers. They were selective about who they worked with, and they were open about that. They worked with projects that they thought were going to be competitive because they wanted to utilize their resources, their scarce resources, as well as possible, right? So definitely we did see that there was part of the reason for these different outcomes is that applicants chose, or excuse me, TA providers in some cases chose to work with specific pools of applicants.
But is that some kind of negative selection? Like maybe the people that are in the disadvantaged communities that need it the most might not have been viewed by them as having the potential for success, so then they decide to give technical assistance in a way that the people that might be disadvantaged and not together, or just disadvantaged again by that decision in that to how to give the technical assistance.
Well, and that's part of the reason that you'll see our recommendations when I get to that part are that this body continue to provide technical assistance to disadvantaged communities, because I think that's right. They may not be as likely to either be able to afford technical assistance if they're paying for it, or get free technical assistance from somebody who's being selective about who they want to provide support to. And so we think that that the SGC pilot played a really unique role in that way. Now, because of the way the pilot was designed, with only applicants from round one who'd been unsuccessful, we think that probably artificially lowered your success rate. and it'll be very interesting to see what happens going forward when the selection criteria maybe change somewhat. Sure.
Just another question, which I guess gets at a different way. For the applicants from disadvantaged communities with which enterprise worked, was their rate of success as high?
Yes, it was. Yes.
So it's really a compositional effect in a way. It's that enterprise wasn't putting as much into disadvantaged communities, but their effectiveness with those disadvantaged communities was just as much as with other communities.
That's right. And I would say, I don't want to speak for enterprise, and I don't want to mischaracterize them. I would say they did work with disadvantaged communities. They primarily worked in urban areas. They worked with the big cities primarily, and they worked with projects that were considered disadvantaged communities and non-disadvantaged communities within those urban areas. So I think that's where they were being selective. I don't think that they were excluding disadvantaged communities, and I don't mean to imply that.
No, I think we're just trying to understand the pattern in the data, not cast aspersions.
Thank you. Any other questions before I continue? Okay, great. So I wanted, speaking of enterprise, the third point is that we think that the enterprise model did have some distinct advantages. They focused on specific cities rather than entire regions, and so they worked with cities where they thought there was great opportunity. And they began working with prospective applicants and cities well before the NOFA was released, which those who were working under the TA pilot really didn't have the benefit of having that much time, because they only received the list of applicants they were going to work with, in some cases, weeks before the concept application were due. So there was just not a lot of time for the TA providers that were associated with the pilot to work with applicants. And thirdly, another thing that Enterprise did really well is that they emphasized partnership development between the AHSC applicants, who are primarily developers, and transportation agencies. So they really worked very hard to kind of create those strong relationships, which we saw across the board were quite impactful as far as making applications more competitive. So looking at disadvantaged communities in particular, we saw that technical assistance was really essential. Of the 25 awards, 21 went to projects benefiting disadvantaged communities. All but one used technical assistance. And we also found that projects serving disadvantaged communities were less likely to reach the full application stage without technical assistance. So among those disadvantaged community applicants who did not have TA, only 18% reached the full application stage. But among non-disadvantaged community applicants, 55% reached the full application stage without TA. So that shows that there's a particular need to get involved early with these projects to make sure that they're competitive at the concept application stage. We spent some time looking at the greenhouse gas analysis component of the methodology, because this was widely seen as the most difficult aspect of the application process. From what we heard from both applicants and TA providers, is that this was a real source of confusion and frustration and disappointment in many cases. We examined two components of the GHG methodology. The first was that there was disparities between the GHG estimates submitted by the applicants and those that were confirmed by ARB. And so we wanted to understand what was the source of those disparities. And then we also looked at whether or not there was subjective application of the CAPCOA project settings amongst the applicants. So what we found when we looked at the disparities between the applicant GHG estimates and the ARB estimates is that there were 9 applicants who had very large discrepancies between their GHG estimate and ARB's. The median difference in this group was 123,500 metric tons of GHG. Very big. And so we thought, what's going on with these 9 projects? Well, we found these that shared certain characteristics. They're all from the Central Bay Area. Most were ICP, while 3 were TOD. Transform conducted the GHG analysis for 7 of the 9 applications, and many relied on free bus transit passes as a major source of GHG reductions. So in order to know which of these factors or other factors were actually responsible for it, we'd have to see ARB's analysis and the applicant's analysis, and we don't have access to that data. So we can't tell you which of these were the causal factors. Additional analysis would be required to do that, but we thought it was these patterns might indicate where some of the problems might lie. But beyond those 9 outliers, it's important to recognize that they were not the only ones that were having this problem. So even among non-outliers, the mean GHG difference was 3,361 metric tons of GHG. So applicants far and wide across the state all saw these discrepancies, which of course were really significant because it was the ARB numbers that were used to determine your score. And so if your ARB number turned out to be much smaller than the one you submitted, it meant your application was less competitive. We think that the reasons for these discrepancies include calculation errors, faulty assumptions, miscommunication between ARB and the TA providers about the methodology, and then lastly, just the limitations of CalEMod, which is the model that was used to do this. No model is perfect. All models have their problems, and CalEMod is no exception. The other issue with GHGs we wanted to look at was the subjective use of CAPCOA project settings. So as you may recall, every project had to pick a project setting. These ranged from urban to low-density suburban. Urban includes places like San Francisco and downtown Oakland. Low-density suburban would be kind of the more kind of suburban cul-de-sac model that we see kind of in the ex-urban area. And these project settings were important because each project setting was associated with a VMT cap. So in other words, your project can only reduce VMT up to a certain threshold depending on the project setting. And so what we heard from TA providers anecdotally as well as applicants was that they thought that some people were applying these project settings subjectively, trying to put their project into a higher category in order to have a higher VMT score and therefore score more competitively. So we wanted to test this and see if there was any evidence to support this this assertion. So what we did is we used walk score to compare the project setting type. Now, walk score is not an exact proxy for project setting, but it is a pretty good one. Walk score is, pardon me, my computer's freezing. Okay, whatever. So walk score is based on a number of factors, including intersection density, population density, and the number of amenities within walking distance of a given parcel. And so you can see on the left, these are the walk score categories. So anything like scores above 90 is considered walker's paradise, and then it goes down to very walkable, somewhat walkable, anything below 50 being car dependent. So what we did is for every project that applied in round 2, we compared their project setting to their walk score to see whether or not they matched up. And what we found, as you can see on the right, is that the mean walk score for each of the project settings were not exactly what we expected. So, for example, under the urban, which is, again, this is supposed to be San Francisco and downtown Oakland, we saw that the mean walk score was just an 81, which is lower than we would have expected. And then similarly, we thought urban centers seemed a bit low as well at 71, which is on the low end of very walkable. And then suburban center and low-density suburban were only 3 points apart. Their mean score is 59 and 56, which shows that there's really not much of a difference between the projects in these two categories. And we also think it's interesting to note, if you look at the max score and the lowest score, in each category there was a max score that was above 95, and there was a low score below 50. So what we saw is there was really a huge range of
Come on, where were the walkers' paradises? Where were they?
I can't tell you off the top of my head. Sorry. If I knew that, I'd let you know. So anyway, we think that this provides evidence that there was subjective application of the CAPCOA project settings and that they were not really being applied consistently.
And can I add to the interruption?
Sure.
So it sounds like they're subjectively applying their own CAPCOA or their project setting definitions. Does ARB then, during the evaluation process, did they apply those settings?
So the applicants did choose their own, you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, the applicants did choose their project setting, and then those were verified by the MPOs, I believe, not ARB. Is that right?
Okay, so the MPOs had the final call on determining which project setting they actually fell in?
It was MPOs with ARB. And we'll talk about the project setting piece too more, Monica, and with AG, because we responded to that pretty directly as well. So
Excellent. Thanks. I'll hold.
Okay, great. Okay, actually, we're getting close. The last major issue I want to talk about was regional disparities in technical assistance. And so I want to focus on two regions where we saw that there was some disparities about how technical assistance was used. The first is in Southern California, where there was a mismatch between available TA and applicants. So more than half of the round two applicants from the SCAG region did not receive major TA, and the majority of those, 74%, were from jurisdictions other than the city of Los Angeles. Now this is a bit strange because SCAG had offered subsidized technical assistance to all AHSC applicants, but applicants for whatever reason didn't take advantage of that, when I asked SCAG about it, they thought that some applicants just did not realize that TA was available. And the other thing is that there was 29 applicants in the SCAG region that were eligible for assistance through the SGC TA pilot, but only 20% of those actually submitted an application. Now, some of that was expected because a lot of the round one projects were just totally not appropriate for AHSC, and so there was you anticipated that there was going to be some drop-off. Nonetheless, it's pretty striking that only 6 projects out of 29 actually took you up on the technical assistance that was offered. In rural California, it's a slightly different story. So this is a category that includes the Central Coast, the Sierra Nevada, the Northern Sacramento Valley, and the North Coast. There was 13 applicants in round 2 from those areas. None of them were eligible for the SGC TA pilot, and most of these areas lack MPOs, or their MPOs are very small and resource constrained and were not offering subsidized TA. So Transform was the only major TA provider in rural California, and they were not subsidized to work in rural California, so applicants there had to pay out of pocket for the support that they received from Transform. So really, the take home here is that rural California really had no subsidized technical assistance whatsoever. They were the only part of the state that didn't. Well, there was no one eligible from round 1 for the TA pilot, because that was part of the criteria. Is you had to have applied in round 2 and not been successful in order to get the SGC's technical assistance, and there was not any project from rural California that fit that description. And as I noted before, there are not MPOs in a lot of these places, and then what we saw is that was the other major source of technical assistance was from the MPOs, and because there's not MPOs there, or they're very small MPOs. They just didn't have the capacity to provide that support. The final issue I just want to touch on is coordination between state agencies and TA providers. The TA providers we spoke with noted significant challenges to effective coordination with state agencies, including, I mentioned this before, the timing of the TA contracts. There was just not enough time for providers to work with applicants before the concept applications were due. They felt that there was a lack of knowledge transfer at the beginning, so TA providers just kind of jumped in and started working with applicants without really kind of having a chance to get any training or clarification about the guidelines prior to starting their work. And I think the third point is connected to that. They were trying to get questions answered on the fly because they had not. I think a lot of the TA providers themselves were not really prepared to start working with applicants at the beginning. And so they were trying to get questions answered on the fly, and they found it very difficult to do that in a timely manner, especially with looming deadlines and whatnot. So recommendations. So with two slides of recommendations, and they kind of fall into 4 buckets. The first is to provide targeted and flexible technical assistance to applicants most in need. So we recommend you continue to target your technical assistance to applicants from disadvantaged communities who clearly need it and may not have access to it otherwise. And to use a flexible approach so that if certain applicants who are eligible for TA decide not to use it, those resources should be reallocated to applicants who will use it. Number 2, update the criteria for selecting applicants. So clearly this was just a pilot, and the way that the group was chosen was in part to constrain it. We recommend you're going to have to come up with some new eligibility criteria to ensure those resources are not being spent on applications that are unlikely to win an award. And we recommend avoiding duplication of efforts with other major technical assistance providers. If there's a limited pool of technical assistance out there, it makes sense to spread it around rather than concentrating your resources on applicants who are already getting subsidized support from someone else. And consider designating some TA resources specifically for rural California. Number 3, improve guidance and oversight for the GHG analysis. So we think there's a real need to work with TA providers to improve clarity and communication around the GHG methodology so we don't see the kinds of errors that we saw last year, and to provide additional guidance and oversight on the CAPCOA project settings, which it sounds like you're going to be hearing about from Monica. And number 4, improve coordination between state agencies and TA providers, including an in-person training at the beginning so that TA providers can get their questions answered before they start working with applicants. Increasing the amount of time that TA providers have to work with applicants prior submission of applications, and to really encourage learning and sharing of best practices amongst all interested TA providers. Since SGC doesn't have the resources to provide TA to everyone, it's in your best interest to make sure that the TA providers who are out there, who are working with applicants, have the best information and are giving them the best support they can. All right, with that, I'll take questions.
So I have a quick question. Obviously, this was designed to critique it and to improve it, but I do note that of the approved projects, 24 out of 25 received TA, which I'd like to underscore. It seems like it was pretty successful overall. I just wonder if you have a comment about it, stepping back from it a bit from the critique.
Well, you know, we're academics, so that's what we do. We critique, right? No, but absolutely. I mean, we just saw overwhelmingly that TA was essential to projects being competitive in this round, and it's important to recognize too that some of the TA providers, like SCAG, was one of the TA teams that you were working with. They were also providing free TA to applicants in their region. It was basically identical TA. So it's not like they were doing something different with the other applicants they were working with. And so in part, even though that 13% number does look low, it's important to recognize that that kind of the TA model was more diffuse than that, and there was a lot of applicants that were in the other categories that were getting similar types of support. So absolutely, I think looking at the project overall, it's been a tremendous success.
And then, of course, it's ultimately it's a zero-sum game, right? I mean, the better the TA is and the more extensive it is, that means that you still, if you have the same number of applicants and the same number of awards, you're not everybody is going to get an award. So how do you kind of factor that into the evaluation?
Well, I think I think the question for SGC is, you know, how do you want to spend the limited resources that you have? And it was my understanding, you know, of the intent of the program is to really make sure that if there's communities and projects that would be able to receive an award but for the lack of capacity, technical capacity that they can bring to the table, they would be competitive for these projects, that's the place where you want to target your resources. And I think that we saw that, even though that 13% number doesn't look particularly high, we know that those are applicants who were not getting help from anywhere else and probably wouldn't have gotten an award had they not had assistance from this program. And again, with making some changes to applicant eligibility, I think the potential for success is much higher going forward.
Manuel.
So a couple of comments, then 3 questions. First, great presentation. I know now why you got your master's, very successful. We do a lot of work with PolicyLink. I'm an academic. Their slogan is lifting up what works, and I would say the academic slogan is pointing out what doesn't. So I do think that the chairman's point about how this was actually a pretty good idea and seems to have had some huge impact, particularly with the first tables that you were showing about how critical it was, is just a really kind of good message, because it was a decision to set aside that money. So I'm glad that we did it. Here's the 3 questions. I don't know how much you can answer. So was the enterprise really more successful, or were they more selective? That might, because if they were really more successful, maybe we want to get more of them. Second, aside from resources, how do we get to the rural areas? Is it just resources, or is it more than that? Not understanding the situation, et cetera. And then finally, if I'm hearing the data right, why the low take-up in the SCAG area, when that was one of the places where we really wanted to address the disparity in awards by addressing a potential disparity in capacity?
So I'll try to remember all three. You might have to remind me, but I'll start with the enterprise question. And was it a question of them being more effective or them being more selective? I think it was both. As I mentioned, I do think that there was real advantages to their model, and in part, they did do technical assistance with round one applicants as well. So they already had some experience under their belt coming into this, which the other TA teams, not as much. And being constrained from timelines, they were able to start working with a pipeline of applicants well before the NOFA was released. So I think they did some certain things really well. And again, the emphasis on partnership development, I think, was really crucial. But they were also selective about who they worked with. As far as kind of relative weights of both, I don't know. I mean, maybe we do a regression analysis or something, but we didn't really go into that depth to try to understand and kind of tease apart those two threads. So that's my kind of not very academic answer to that one. As far as rural California goes, we found that the technical assistance was not available, but that there was a number of applicants who really wanted to apply, and there was some who were successful in rural California. So clearly there are communities that are a good fit for these types of awards. We did see in the San Joaquin Valley, there was a number of rural projects that were awarded, and of course projects in the San Joaquin Valley did have good technical assistance. And so I think we can look at the fact that there was a number of good rural projects that TA seemed to really benefit rural projects in the San Joaquin Valley, and then you look at rural California where the TA wasn't available and you didn't see as high of a success rate. So I think that indicates that if TA were available in rural California, it would make a difference. And your third question.
Why the relatively low take-up in SCAG?
Yes. I think it's a combination of factors. The first, again, round one being the only pool of applicants that you were drawing from for the TA pilot, there was a number of just kind of very projects that were just really fundamentally not competitive for AHSC that kind of threw their hats in the ring for round one for whatever reason. And so there was SGC staff told me that they anticipated there was going to be drop-off because a lot of those projects realized we're just not competitive for this program. We need to look elsewhere. And amongst those that did stick around, I don't know. I mean, I can't tell you. I think some realized that maybe they were not quite ready for this year, that they still want to apply at some point, but that they have a couple years of work ahead of them. Maybe they'll apply round 3, round 4. It'll be interesting to see. And I know SCAG is one of the things that they've done is made an effort to kind of continue tracking those projects and to provide kind of capacity building assistance so that they're kind of on track to apply at a time when they might be more competitive. And then as far as SCAG's TA program and why applicants were not taking advantage of the free TA that was offered there, what SCAG told me is that they felt their way of communicating with potential applicants was through the cities that are part of SCAG, and that these applicants were not in communication with their cities, so they didn't know. Had they been in touch with their cities would have told them TA is available, but because they weren't, they were just kind of off on their own. SCAG didn't know about them until the concept applications were submitted.
Do you have any sense of whether the technical assistance work was more directed towards the form of the application or whether they made substantial substantive changes in the work that was being proposed? And then also any sense on what it would take to fully fund this program?
And fully funded as far as having every applicant have technical assistance? I'd have to think about that. But you had 129 applicants in round 1, or excuse me, in round 2. About 35 of those, I want to say, received technical assistance from SGC, and it was what, $500,000? So I think you'd have to triple that. $1.5 million or something. But that's not considering the fact that groups like SCAG are out there also providing subsidized TA. So that's just a back of the envelope guess on that. As to the question about the type of TA that was being provided, well, far and away, the greenhouse gas quantitative methodology was the most popular form of technical assistance, and that's those who had to pay out of pocket for it. That's generally what they were paying for, and I think the disparities that we saw and the problems with that indicate that people were intimidated by it and wanted help with it. I would say that for the SGC TA pilot, because the technical assistance came relatively late in the process, what I heard from TA providers is that they felt that they didn't have enough time to really work with applicants and with transportation agencies to come up with adding new transit projects to the mix because there just wasn't time. And so they were really focused on just kind of making the application as strong as possible. Whereas those who had a little more time, like Enterprise, were working months and months in advance to try to build those relationships, build the partnerships to then get stronger transportation projects into the applications.
Other questions? Okay, terrific. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Monica.
Good afternoon, Council. I want to give a big thanks to Autumn for doing the evaluation and fielding all of the hard questions. So it should be a little easier for me. Just want to say that the evaluation, we're really grateful to have had the time and space to conduct the evaluation. It really corroborates not only staff's experience in delivering the pilot technical assistance, but also the experience of our technical assistance providers themselves and in reports and evaluations that they submitted to us. All the recommendations are really aligned. So glad to hear that we're all on the same page and have ideas and steps in how we can move forward. So for today, I'll just run really quickly through two things. First, some of the actions we've already taken in enacting the recommendations that Autumn outlined for you. And we're getting ready to launch our next iteration of technical assistance for AHSC. So those will be incorporated in very soon. And then very, very quickly, you all have seen a couple of presentations on this, but I'll just give you some brief updates on what we're doing for our California Climate Investments Technical Assistance Program. Again, continuing to take the lessons we've learned in this pilot and growing them to address programs throughout climate investments. So first and foremost, we've already talked a lot about this today. How do we select the technical assistance recipients that we work with? And so we are looking at figuring out some kind of criteria that weighs the need for technical assistance resources, the needs to assist disadvantaged and low-income communities, and certainly project viability and cost effectiveness. I think the one thing that I would add to the conversation that's been had so far is that not all disadvantaged communities are created equal, and really the question is about community capacity to pursue a competitive grant application. That's really the difference we saw, where if there is a city that is willing to put in time and energy and staff to putting together an affordable housing sustainable communities application, they were largely successful. And so there's a lot of communities out there that do not have that staff, do not have that time, do not have those resources, even if TA is handed to them. So what we're trying to do is find a balance between that. We want to continue to provide support to those communities that are a little more challenging, and we have to have a little bit more of a longer term approach with those communities, but find those that are maybe gems that might have a little bit more time and ability and capacity to absorb the technical assistance and then move forward with an AHSC application. So those are the things that we're trying to balance, and we're working very closely with our stakeholders and technical assistance provider this round to kind of find that sweet spot. Managing the AHSC TA ecosystem, which I'm glad you termed it because I have had the hardest time describing this. It's very challenging to corral, fee-for-service technical assistance providers as SGC, and fortunately we have a lot of partners across the state who have sort of peer learning groups and other networks that we can tap into. But two things that we're going to try to take in terms of sort of managing this ecosystem is more coordinated TA teams. So actually, I will give props on this one to the technical assistance providers that have come forward for this round to participate with SGC. A lot of them have actually come together. So a lot of the folks that you saw in that major TA category that Autumn described have actually merged and created these super technical assistance teams, for lack of a better word, to serve the entire state. So a lot of that duplication of efforts should hopefully be streamlined and better coordinated, and they will all be working with Strategic Growth Council, or quite a few of them. So we're hoping that will help with some of the coordination of service delivery. Another thing that we're going to hope to do is establish more of a peer learning network. So all of those folks that are providing technical assistance on AHSC, we can have quarterly webinars, provide trainings so that information is consistent and that we can share best practices now that we actually have them, that the program's been around for a while. Rural and Southern California. So like Autumn mentioned, there were a couple of rural applicants we got to work with that were within the regions that we had set. So for example, and like she mentioned, in the San Joaquin Valley, we did get to work with a couple of rural applicants and we saw some success there. This year, we're going to have a whole team dedicated to that balance of the state. So North State, Coast, Sierras. We'll have a whole team working just in those communities. So we'll be able to reach folks in Arcata and Bishop and other places like that, hopefully this year, better than we were last year. last year we had just such a need to work with a finite group of people that it really constrained us. And additionally, there is a rural advisor, so a rural specialist on each of the other regional teams. So if we do have, San Joaquin Valley is an easy one, rural applicants within that region, there will be somebody specialized to work with those rural applicants on each of the teams. So hopefully we'll meet the needs of our rural applicants a little better this year with that approach. And then Southern California, again, a lot has been said about that. We did have a hard time getting uptake of technical assistance based on the applicants we had last round. As a result, we worked in partnership with SCAG and our technical assistance providers there to do a lot of capacity building. We did, it says 9 workshops there. We did, I think, closer to 12 in everywhere outside of the city of LA. So every county, Imperial County, San Bernardino, Riverside, Orange, we were everywhere. And we engaged not just dozens, but 200 individual stakeholders throughout Southern California in the months since round 2. So we've really grown our network in Southern California. We've found more applicants than we had found before. And we're hopeful that this year we'll have better communication and the relationships that we really need to make sure TA makes it to the folks that need it in Southern California. The only other thing I would add about Southern California, not to scoop my colleagues, we're going to talk about the guidelines, but there have also been some changes in the guidelines that we think will also assist more suburban Southern California applicants in being competitive for the program. Real quick, some inconsistencies on the greenhouse gas quantification. So some of this has been addressed in the guidelines again. So we have actually, what Autumn was describing as far as the project settings, that has actually been standardized. So this year you will no longer be selecting your project setting. If you're in the TOD category, you have one project setting and you roll with that one. If you're an ICP, you have one and you roll with that. Rural, same thing. So it should clear up some of that inconsistency, which led to a lot of confusion and inconsistencies in the calculations. ARB has also worked really hard to clarify the QM, the quantification methodology, quite a bit. And then we're also hoping to offer much clearer training. We did not train our TA providers last year, quite honestly. We just did not have the time. But this year we're already scheduling guidelines and quantification methodology training. The Area Resources Board is working on an instructional video with us as well. So we're really hoping to get out there how we can all be consistent in how we quantify our GHGs for this program. So hopefully that'll work a little bit better this year. Really quick, so just moving forward, so this year we have $2 million to do technical assistance across the climate investments programs. We're really excited to take the successes and the wins, which I'm glad we remembered there were successes and wins in the program, and grow them to reach the other climate investments programs. Just to show you, we've kind of refined our 3 goals of the program. We want to really continue to offer direct assistance to communities. We know that disadvantaged and low-income communities need help with these applications and with greenhouse gas quantification, and it's not going to make a difference if we don't have that. So we're going to continue to work on that. We want to continue to build the capacity of communities in these subject areas, so quantifying GHGs, and also looking at more broadly at the whole suite of climate investments programs. And then that really lends to the third. We want to work with communities to actually layer and integrate these programs so that we really achieve our goals in the long run. So what that looks like, we've been working very hard over the last few months to engage a lot of your agencies in this technical assistance program. And thank you, Secretary Ross, for already lifting up some of the great work that CDFA has done in technical assistance. So we're working with a whole host of agencies this year. A lot of these are selected because they still have appropriated funds to expend. So that's why we're going to be able to plug in technical assistance with them. So we're working with, again, a diversity of programs, and you can see AHSC is back up there for this year, as well as the Transformative Climate Communities program. And so just going back, I think that, again, we really want to move forward in encouraging communities to consider the whole swath of programs, but we also see that there's still a need to have some focus on the individual programs because they're so specific, because the quantification methodologies are specific, but we hope to build, particularly in our capacity building activities, towards communities really understanding the whole host of opportunities that they have in front of them and assistance that really integrates them all together. So, some programs are moving faster. CDFA has been wonderful. They've already moved on some of this. We're still getting started with some of the other programs, but we're hoping to have all of the programmatic work started by September this year. So that's about all I've got. Happy to take any questions.
Questions, comments? Okay. Thank you very much. I will observe that the TA work has been really important and essential, and hopefully we'll have a chance to expand it. All right, I have two comments. First, Steve Sanders, followed by Phoebe Seaton. Hey, Steve.
Hi, good afternoon. Steve Sanders with the Institute for Local Government. Just wanted to make a couple of quick points. One, we super appreciate the effort and the willingness on the part of the SGC to actually evaluate what you've been doing and to learn from it, and then to adapt as you go along. And so I think round 3 will be even better than round 2, which was better than round 1. So I think, you know, that this willingness on the part of your departments and your agencies and the state to learn, take a solid look, and then adapt and move forward is something that, and to do it quickly, not as a regular part of the work that you do. It's really exemplary of the kind of thing that we need to do to have rapid success in climate action. We also welcome the broader focus on capacity building. We recognize it's a technical assistance program, but you know, putting on your hat as the Strategic Growth Council, looking at coordinating the state's long-term effort in sustainability, building the readiness and capacity of local communities to act on climate is going to be necessary to succeed. Across the street, they're looking at the next 10 years for cap and trade. You're looking at the scoping plan, which runs through 2080 in terms of goals that we have. So this is a long-term endeavor. And it's true that a lot of places are willing to and able to take advantage of the programs that you have. And it's also true that the technical assistance you're providing is helping more applicants to do that. But we see a real problem 3 or 4 years down the road, which is, does the pipeline start getting reduced because of the the lack of capacity and readiness on the part of those beyond the early adopter stage. And so as we look to rural California, as we look to the San Joaquin Valley, as we look to some of the small to medium-sized cities in the LA Basin or the desert areas, there's going to be a need for them to know how to actually participate, not just in AHSC or even California Climate Investments, but more broadly in the whole suite of state and regional programs that they're going to want to take advantage of. And so our experience has been that it sometimes takes a year or two of working with communities to get them to that point of readiness where they're even understanding how it's to their benefit, what they need to do internally to get ready, who they need to assign things for, what those people need to learn, how they need to connect for them to get ready. And so that's the work that we're trying to do at ILG through our Beacon program. We are now up to 123 cities and counties and seeing a tremendous uptake in demand. And so I think we've reached that tipping point of interest. And right now it's going to be, I think, up to the council to be taking a look, just what we're going to do with this set of guidelines, this round of funding, but the next and the next and the next, and how do we get a city 3 or 4 years from now to be in the position where they can take advantage of SB1 or the Active Transportation Program or any of the CCI programs or anything new that might come along. And so we want to continue partnering with you and your staff on this. We think the work that's done here, there's some good lessons. One of them really is the need to work earlier and more deeply with a lot of these communities. Speaking of rural California, CR Business Council has been working with us to bring people into the Beacon program. We've had Jackson, Plymouth, Alpine County
Let me ask you to wrap up.
And so there's an interest, and we hope that as you design your next rollout and what you'll be doing in the next couple of years, that you build in long-term capacity building. Thank you.
Thank you. Phoebe.
Thanks. Good afternoon. I kind of also just wanted to touch on that. I know that there's a lot of competing needs for the TA program. We do always have concern kind of to the extent that kind of viable projects or project readiness is weighed because of often the need is deepest and the return on investment is greatest in places that have the lowest capacity. So I think that we want to make sure that we are kind of targeting some of the investments to the greatest need. I think looking at kind of the long view, I would also love to see maybe kind of a continued analysis of the TA program and its impact on projects down the line, not just in a 3-month turnaround period, but how TA or the Beacon project or other projects really impact competitiveness in kind of more of a longer view, 2 to 3 years. I would think that it would bear out that you kind of get in on the ground floor while projects might not be ready immediately. It gets them ready for future years. So I think that we'd like to continue advocate for intensive investments on the outreach and TA side, even irrespective of whether there's going to be a project that year. And I have a couple questions, and I'm sorry I missed it. The $2 million, Monica, is that inclusive of any appropriation that happens this year, or would that add on to this year's TA program?
It's the appropriated in last year's appropriation and included for all the CCI and programs from last year's appropriation.
There might be more. There theoretically could be more if there's more appropriated in this year's GGRF appropriation.
Well, if you go across the street and lobby when you're done speaking, there could be some more.
I've heard the revenue discussion is not for today. I put in my time. And then I guess my other question is another resources question on have you thought at all about the kind of the percentage breakdown of what's going to go towards the TA and what's going to go towards the outreach and engagement component? Yeah.
Yes. We are still thinking that through with our interagency partners for each program. I mean, each program is obviously at a different stage in its development, literally. You know, AHSC is in its 3rd year. Some programs are in their 1st year. Some have a different host of partners. Some have different ways that we want to see them integrated, like our transportation and housing related programs, for instance. A lot more opportunities for immediate integration. And so we'll see more of that finalized, I think, later this summer as we work with our partners to determine kind of greatest need for greatest programs. So stay tuned.
Okay, and I'll use my last 11 seconds to say again, thanks so much to the SGC for leadership on the directed TA, but also looking at kind of the holistic picture and comprehensive TA around climate investments, and that's it.
Okay, thank you for that. Let's move to item 7, Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities Program, final draft guidelines.
Hello, Chair Alex and council members. As Randall mentioned, my name is Dov Kaden, and I'm going to be providing program management for the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities Program at the Strategic Growth Council in partnership with HCD and ARB. So today we are considering the final draft guidelines for AHSC for adoption. I'm going to give a quick program overview here, and then I'll talk about some of the big picture changes that we've made since the 2nd round. I'll then hand it over to Craig Shields from the State Department of Housing and Community Development, who will go into a little bit more detail on the proposed changes as well as the project timeline. As you all know, the AHSC vision is a fairly lofty one. We use cap and trade dollars to fund infill projects that reduce greenhouse gas emissions and vehicle miles traveled through sustainable land use, housing, and transportation practices. AHSC projects accomplish this reduction in VMT by creating more location-efficient housing, but also supporting mode shift to those low-carbon transportation options like walking, biking, and transit. This grant really brings together the affordable housing and the transportation worlds, which we understand is easier said than done, but we truly believe builds capacity that can facilitate future opportunities for collaboration down the road. So after 2 rounds of AHSC, we have funded 60 projects totaling $440 million across the state. Over 80% of that is benefiting disadvantaged communities, which is far above our statutory requirement of 50. AHSC has created 4,500 new affordable units. And then these projects will reduce 1.1 million tons of carbon dioxide over their operating lives. They will also result in 8,000 less cars and 93 million less miles driven every single year. AHSC funds both capital projects as well as programs. The capital projects typically include an affordable housing development, which is the only portion that we administer as a loan. The rest are grants. On the capital project side, the program also funds housing-related infrastructure, sustainable transportation infrastructure, and transportation-related amenities. AHSC can also fund a variety of programs, as I mentioned, including shared mobility programs, educational programs, and transit subsidy programs as well. So eligible applicants include really a whole host of public agencies at all scales of government, housing developers as well, school districts, and as of this round, federally recognized Indian tribes as well. Looking back at some of the highlights from the round 2 guidelines, we introduced the rural innovation project areas to ensure the viability of projects in rural areas. We also created funding targets for each of the 3 project types, which you see up there, which was intended to ensure a more equitable distribution of funds across the state's diverse communities. In addition, we also added new scoring criteria and clarified many of the definitions related to transit and transportation. So since round 2, we conducted a series of what we called lessons learned workshops. Those were last December to solicit input on how we could improve the guidelines for the 3rd round. And then based on that feedback, a draft 3rd round guidelines document was released in March of this year, which I believe was presented as an informational item in the April council meeting. We then held additional public workshops to get feedback on the draft guidelines in April. And the final draft guidelines, which we are considering today, were released on June 5th. So all in all, we received 60 letters and 400 comments that have helped to really inform the guidelines that you see today. So the final draft guidelines include a variety of changes, both to the structure as well as the content. I'm going to touch on some of the more structural changes here, and then Craig will get into a little bit more of the specifics. But the guidelines have been reorganized and streamlined in the interest of providing redundancy, avoiding redundancy, not providing it, and making them easier to read and understand, really. And so a big effort was made to more clearly articulate the criteria and the expectations, but to do so in a more of a condensed fashion. So throughout this process, the document has actually been shortened by over 20 pages. The application process itself has also been dramatically simplified. We've moved away from the concept proposal, which was the precursor to the full application in the first 2 rounds, and we've replaced it with a single application and then the option to have one-on-one consultations with program staff to determine eligibility, but then also to provide some general comments regarding project competitiveness. We also converted select scoring criteria to threshold requirements. So in the last round of AHSC, there were a number of project elements for which the majority of applicants received maximum points, which was not super helpful for differentiating between the applicants. So in the interest of remedying that, we've moved several of those to threshold requirements. So things like urban greening are now thresholds, and so all applicants are now required to incorporate those elements into their project. So our next step in the application process is releasing the NOFA and the application, which we expect to do on October 2nd. We would then conduct the one-on-one consultations I mentioned to help applicants with any of those specific questions. That would be in the pre-application phase you see there. And then, as I mentioned in the last slide, we've done away with the concept application. So the next big milestone would be the actual application due date, which we anticipate being on January 15th. At this point, program staff would review the thresholds and conduct a readiness review to look at the approvals and requirements in place at time of submittal. If applicants meet all of those thresholds, the state would then review the quantitative scoring items as well as the GHG quantification methodology. Initial score letters would then be released, which applicants do have an opportunity to appeal through a formal appeal process. And then once the quantitative scores have been finalized, applicants that have attained over 50% of the total points up until that point would move on to the interagency state review of the narrative-based scoring sections. So then we would finalize our rankings and release our staff recommendations before coming back to council for final approval. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Craig.
Great. Thanks, Todd. Good afternoon. I just want to start by thanking all of the stakeholders, applicants, awardees who participated in our working lessons learned workshops and contributed their comments and feedback that informed these enhancements to this round of guidelines. As signaled in the round 2 guidelines, AHSC will no longer fund structured or surface parking in our affordable housing developments. Also, as Autumn mentioned, to ensure consistency in the application of project setting types within project area types, CalEMod project settings will automatically align with project area types. With over 100 federally recognized Indian tribes in California, California is home to more Indian tribes than any other state. Those federally recognized tribes will now be eligible applicants in round 3. Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities program encourages collaboration at every opportunity. When this collaboration results in a joint application to the program, a commitment of joint and several liability is required. In an effort to respond to stakeholder concerns regarding the reluctance of some applicants to engage in these agreements, the scoring incentive for joint applicants has been removed, which creates an even playing field for all sole applicants and joint applicants. I'm sorry, I'm not advancing the slides. There we go. In round 2, there were several project elements, as Dodd mentioned, where majority of applicants received full points, so those were not good scoring criteria. They have been moved to threshold. Additionally, we have introduced a couple new threshold criteria. Applicants must demonstrate that the housing element for their jurisdiction is in compliance with state housing element law. Also, we know that trees and green spaces in our neighborhoods provide many environmental and community benefits. They can help reduce flooding, maintain air quality, reduce urban heat islands, and provide community space for neighborhood socializing. In support of these many benefits, AHSC projects must incorporate at least 2 urban greening components. Additionally, these components must include adequate lighting to make them usable on those rare occasions the sun is not shining in California. Recognizing also the many benefits of making free or discounted transit passes available to residents, round 3 of affordable housing developments must provide discounted or free transit passes to residents, 1 pass per unit for a term of 3 years. Also, following the lead of the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development, as well as about 40 communities, cities, and counties across California, housing funded by AHSC will be smoke-free. That means families will not be subjected to health implications of secondhand smoke while they're in and around their homes. In addition to requiring 20% of units as affordable, these revised guidelines also require the average affordability be no more than 50% of area median income. Also, round 3 applicants must demonstrate funding commitments for a minimum of 90% of total project costs. Sorry. We also include a threshold requirement to address AB 1550, which was signed into law last year. AB 1550 modifies the overall investment minimums for GGRF programs for disadvantaged communities and introduces new income minimums for low-income households and low-income communities. We will be including the AB 1550 criteria from the Air Resources Board funding guidelines in our fall NOFA. Also, this round will introduce CalEnviroscreen 3.0, which replaces 2.0. Several updates have been made to various scoring criteria based on stakeholder feedback. Points will be awarded to applications that restrict a percentage of units in their affordable housing developments to extremely low-income households. This round also increases available points for proposals that implement strategies or are located in jurisdictions with strategies designed to prevent the displacement of local community residents and locally owned businesses. AHSC will continue to incentivize programs that encourage active transportation like walking and biking, as well as other low-carbon transit options. This year, points will be awarded for applicants who demonstrate prior experience operating programs, as well as points for programs that have provisions to continue beyond the term of the funding. Proposals that include higher ratios of leverage or match funds may require fewer AHSC dollars, allowing the program to fund more projects. This is especially critical in a cycle that represents about half of the total funding amount as the previous cycle. A tiered scoring model will award more points to projects which include a higher percentage of leverage funds. During our lessons learned workshops and public comment periods, we heard loud and clear that subjectivity in the application process should be minimized. To that end, we have reduced subjective scoring criteria to a single narrative section. This is the applicant's opportunity to tell their story in a 4-page or so narrative-based format. This section will be evaluated only for projects that are awarded over 50% of the quantitative and GHG quantification methodology points. Also, to ensure consistency among reviews, a single interagency team will evaluate this section for all applications. Program staff will continue to hold conversations with metropolitan planning organizations to discuss options for additional MPO engagement and participation in the program. Today we are requesting the adoption of these draft guidelines. HCD will release the FY 2016-17 NOFA and application on October 2nd. Following the NOFA and application release, AHSC program staff will hold a series of statewide workshops and consultations to assist applicants in the development of their applications, which will be due January 15, 2018. Staff will make award recommendations in May of 2018, and award announcements by this council are scheduled for June of 2018. Again, we are very pleased to have arrived at this point in the process and to recommend the council's adoption of these draft final guidelines for the FY 2016-17 Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities Program. Thanks. And my colleagues and I are here to respond to questions.
Questions? Okay, I think Manuel.
So the first, great work. Great to see the anti-displacement piece be in there more strongly, particularly given today's New York Times article on how unaffordable California's become. I wonder if we could, and may not be worth it to revise any words here, but in the workforce development, there's no specific mention of the reentry population.
Okay.
And if you think about what the state's trying to do with reducing the prison population and ensuring successful reentry into the labor market, at least sending signals that that's part of what's important about a disadvantaged workforce
Sure.
would, I think, be important. I mean, that's a totally modest, including programs to support reentry sort of phrasing that could be in there, or at least send signals to people when they're applying. I'm like many people.
That's something we can certainly integrate into our workshops.
Yeah, like many people, I'm very happy that we're finally reducing our infatuation with over-incarceration, and very concerned that unless we create successful reentry paths, we are sort of offering a false promise.
Great. Well, we'll try to incorporate some of that into our workshops.
I think maybe I would entertain a motion on the action requested for this item and then go to public comment. So the action requested is the adoption of the final draft guidelines as proposed by staff, right?
I so move.
Is there a second?
Second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. So at this point, we have some public comments, so let's go there and then have a discussion after that. First commenter is Betsy McGovern Garcia, followed by Mariela, looks like Ruacho.
Good afternoon, members of the council. My name is Betsy McGovern Garcia. I'm the Director of Real Estate Development for Self-Help Enterprises. Just want to start by thanking you. We did receive round two awards for projects in disadvantaged communities, rural projects. And so we want to thank you for the opportunity to better serve those disadvantaged communities. Secondly, I want to thank you for being a catalyst for us. We used to think about transportation in the context of how far away we were from a bus stop, and this has really forced us to step outside of our comfort zone. We have new partnerships with MPOs, with transit providers. We're starting to talk about things like ride sharing and ride sourcing, working with our transit providers to provide subsidies for like Uber and Lyft and things of that nature. And so I would just say that we're going after new sources of fund, ARB, CEC, and it's really forced us to think more collectively about transportation in connection with affordable housing. So thank you for pushing us outside of our comfort zone. There is one remaining concern with the Farmland Mapping and Monitoring Tool program. We'd like to thank you for making an exception to that FMMP. We do find quite a few sites in rural California that are larger than 10 acres. Frequently, our organization will go in and will purchase a large site that is surrounded by urban uses. We will develop rental housing, high-density rental housing, in conjunction with single-family housing and parks and health clinics. And so I want to thank you for opening up the conversation of FMMP as a threshold tool. Specifically, the definition of infill found in section 106 for threshold, which then goes to the definition in attachment A, calls for sites that have 75% of the perimeter that are surrounded by urban uses. In looking at a variety of sites throughout rural California, one thing has become very apparent to us, and that is there are rarely perfectly square sites. We're finding sites that are more frequently rectangles. And so it's become problematic for us in looking at a straight 75% definition. We've looked at two very similar sites. They're surrounded by urban uses. They're close to schools, shopping centers, parks, libraries, all of those things. And they are destined to be urban, developed as urban uses. Yet they have one side that's longer, maybe just as little as 14 feet longer. And so it ends up being 73% of the sides are surrounded by urban uses. So I'd like to encourage you as part of the adoption today to add to the definition of infill for sites with 4 sides, at least 3 sides must meet the criteria of being surrounded by urban uses. This would achieve your intent of allowing infill sites into the competition and would acknowledge that no sites are perfectly square. Thank you.
Thank you for that. We'll have staff comment on that issue when we're done with public comment. Mariela, followed by Phoebe Seaton.
Good afternoon, council members. I'm Mariela Rocha. I'm here on behalf of California Relief and 66 other transportation environmental organizations and environmental justice groups that have signed on to this letter. We just want to show our strong support for the incorporating urban greening as a threshold requirement for the affordable housing and sustainable communities funding projects. This revision bridges the long-standing divide between gray and green infrastructure. Research has shown that green and open spaces investments in urban communities provide an array of social, economic, environmental, and public health benefits. This is pertinent to the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Community Program for focusing on disadvantaged communities which have historically been ranked as the most park poor and underserved areas. We commend CSG staff too for their leadership and vision on incorporating and vision on this important issue. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Phoebe, followed by Noor Kauser.
Hi, thanks. On behalf of the Rural Smart Growth Task Force, mostly want to kind of echo or emphasize what Betsy mentioned around the FMMP. We really don't want to feel like there's a not perverse incentive, but that there's some very developable sites in the eastern San Joaquin Valley and eastern Coachella Valley, but for that tool aren't able to compete for this program. There's a couple other just kind of on the rural side concerned that for kind of remaining funds when project areas are competing against each other, there's certain point areas that are going to disadvantage some of the rural applicants, anti-displacement, walk score, et cetera. We've laid it out in letters. And I kind of looking at, we, of course, as Betsy mentioned, really want to make sure that we're pushing rural areas to be more aggressive on some of those areas, but still some of the tools just aren't applicable. Some of the walk score indexes just are not applicable to rural areas. Anti-displacement measures are going to be very different, if at all applicable, for businesses in rural areas. And I'm going to want to kind of urge consideration of a narrative component, possibly to allow the rural applicants in the component of the competition that's going to be head-to-head to kind of make up for some of those points. And especially, I think, in terms of if there's the rebinning is going to be, I guess, highly disadvantageous for some of the rural and maybe ICP projects. So would like to kind of reconsider the kind of rebinning component of the head-to-head competition. And that's it. Thanks so much.
Noor, followed by Jeannie Ward-Waller.
Noor Coster with Housing California. I am here on behalf of the Sustainable Communities for All Coalition. I want to thank you for this opportunity to provide feedback on the HSC program. Our coalition is extremely grateful for many of the improvements to these final draft guidelines and for the openness to feedback from all stakeholders during the drafting process. One change we did notice from a previous draft to the final draft is on the average affordability within an affordable housing development. Previously, staff included in the draft guidelines that all units within an affordable housing development must be no greater than 50% of the area median income, requirement that we supported, as it would help ensure that projects receiving AHSC funding are serving Californians with the most severe housing cost burdens. The final guidelines, however, state that this affordability requirement only applies to the income restricted units within the project. The guidelines only require 20% of units to be income restricted, so this change, number one, provides proportionally fewer affordable homes than an equivalent project with an overall project-wide average affordability of 50% AMI. And number two, the change opens the door to predominantly market rate developments taking advantage of AHSC's other funding priority, transportation infrastructure funding, in order to publicly subsidize their project infrastructure. We know that people making the lowest incomes in our state and many residents on low fixed incomes ride public transit at a greater rate than residents who can afford a market rate apartment. Thus, this change is a missed opportunity to reduce even more greenhouse gases. Our coalition hopes that you will consider changing this. Thank you.
Thank you. Jeannie, followed by Hamid Tayeb.
Good afternoon, council members. Jeannie Ward-Waller with the California Bicycle Coalition, also a member of the Sustainable Communities for All. And in that vein, I want to support Noor's comments from Housing California. We very much agree and support her concerns. And just really am here, though, to thank you for the ongoing improvements and the hard work of staff on this program. I think as we're getting into the third year, we are really pleased with how supportive this program is of active transportation and sustainable transportation in general. The addition of transit passes as a threshold requirement, I think, is terrific. And the scoring criteria for active transportation components is really very strong, and we're really pleased to see how far it's come. In fact, I'm encouraging, and our coalition is encouraging, Caltrans to use the same criteria in the active transportation program, because we think this program's criteria is stronger than what we've seen in the program that's really focused on active transportation. So we hope that we'll be able to continue to align state investments around the same criteria and move the state forward in investing in active transportation. So thank you.
Thank you. Hamid, followed by Edward Sampson.
Good afternoon. My name is Hamid Taib. I'm with Habitat for Humanity. I'm a director of real estate development. And I really want to thank you for the good work you're doing. And we were awarded on the first round. We are, as you know, we are a self-help affordable ownership housing provider. And we just had our groundbreaking on the first development last week. And appreciate your support. And I did hear that from a staff representation that the affordability requirement is below 50%. I just want to make sure that is not like so for us, because we do serve low and very low income families, and we go up to 80% of AMI. And I want to make sure we're not counted out in this round. Thank you.
Thank you. Edward.
Good afternoon, Chairman, members of council. On behalf of the California Coalition for Rural Housing and also a member of the Smart Growth Task Force, just would like to thank you for the work that you've done in rural California, specifically some of the changes that were made from the last guidelines around equitable net density, the elimination of the tools bike score and walk score, within the context of rural, and also looking at the exceptions for the use of the farmland mapping and monitoring program tool in the RIPA competition. Also would like to thank Director Randall Winston and Monica Balmiller for the work that they've done with American Indian communities and making resources available in this round to a much needed subset of our state. And they've been working really hard, I think, for over the last year and a half, going out to communities, listening to their needs, and finally working on the regulations to make sure that the tribal communities in California has access to those resources. So it's not all thank yous, but I think a lot of good work has been done. There are a few issues that we're working on. So I just wanted to echo some of the things around, some of the, especially in rural areas, with the 75% requirement and looking at, various lot sizes. In rural areas, you're not always working with the square. 3 sides may work, but I think staff could figure out a way to make that work, and looking at some of these odd sized lots, or the ways some of them, even in square lots, can be designed where, you could have development on 3 sides and still not meet the 75%. I think that's sort of a minor thing and probably can be worked out. Another thing that when you're looking or digging deep into the weeds is, the process of rebinning, and how, again, since we're the rural California Coalition for Rural Housing, our comments are rural centric. And when you look at the process of rebinning and the max scores that you could get in the RIPA project, a lot of these would not even compete, after everything is rebinned. So, we wanted to mention that. Also, when we're looking at the way it's scored too, also looking for, location deficiency and anti-displacement. Perhaps, even though we're trying to make it more streamlined, there's a way for some of these rural projects through a narrative or even a quantitative description to be able to score better, so, they are able to compete, if it is rebinned. So, again, it's been great working with SGC and on the HSC program, and we look forward to more successful programs. Thanks.
All right. Thank you very much. I'd like to hear whatever staff wants to respond to, but I want to make sure FMMP and the 50%, 20%.
Maybe I'll just say a couple things. initially and then turn it over to Craig and Dov to say a bit more. So first on the farmland mapping and monitoring tool, and I want to thank again Self-Help Enterprises and others who spoke about it and part of the task force with whom we've been working throughout this process to revise the use of that tool. As was mentioned, we did develop an exception, and after kind of an extensive amount of back and forth, we are now going to, I think, for the next round, really look into what was just suggested pretty recently here by that coalition. So we received a letter along with a kind of a recommendation, which you just heard early last week. We want to make sure that we have time to go through, though, an analysis of what the effects of such a change would be. We always are being mindful of unintended consequences, and we certainly want to look into it and will look into it further. So we'll continue to work with our stakeholders and partners on that issue. We know that it's a critical one, and we think that though we've kind of made a good step forward in terms of developing an exception as it is. Next, on the affordability issue, I'll just say, kind of straightforwardly, it is absolutely not the intention of SGC or the new set of guidelines to disincentivize affordable projects. What we wanted to try to do was allow for more mixed incomes projects to be considered. Again, internally with our staff and our host of stakeholders, we've discussed this issue at length, and I think it's one that could evolve in the future. We, however, are not by its very nature, incentivizing non-affordable units. And this, again, it's intended to get at a more mixed income projects. But maybe I can turn it over to our staff here if you want to add anything to either of those elements, Craig, Dov, or any other key staff.
No, thanks. I think you hit both of those very well. We will continue to look at the effects of the identification of farmland and also good, thoughtful mixes of income levels in our projects. We want our neighborhoods to be sustainable, and part of that sustainability is financial feasibility, and having that market rate component really builds into that financial feasibility.
Okay. Any questions, comments, discussions? All right. We have a pending motion to adopt the final draft Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities Program guidelines as presented by staff. All those in favor say aye.
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 Opposed? Okay, so the recommendation is adopted, and thank you for your work on this.
Thank you.
All right, so we have just the general public comments left, and I have one general public comment, Jeannie Ward-Waller.
I'll be quick because I'm sure you all are ready to leave. Jeannie Ward-Waller again with the California Bicycle Coalition. I missed the council member updates at the beginning, so I'm assuming that Kate White said something about this, but the transportation sector generally is very engaged in SB 1 implementation. I'm sure you all are very aware that the state is going to be investing significant new funds over the next 10 years in transportation. And I just want to, raise it on your radar and look forward to potentially a future discussion item on your agenda. The CTC is doing tons of workshops, and it's an incredible amount of work for advocates to track and be involved in, and really try to support the interagency strategic growth ideals that you all support here. So I think there would be a lot of value in discussions here, and your staff potentially participating or weighing in on some of those workshops and guidelines processes. So just want to leave you with that. Thank you.
I think the odds are good. Okay, any other business? Wow, record time. Thank you all very much. We are adjourned.